Wow. Hey, good to have Lydia back, everybody. It's good to have her back. She's back from her doctor of veterinary school for a couple of Sundays, and great. Thank you so much. Kevin Grove, that was awesome on the dobro. And then everybody say welcome to Rigo. I was thinking of Glenn Velez. Rigo Velez, good to have Rigo with us from the North Texas University. And it's awesome to have everybody back in the band this morning. The songs today, the lyrics today are so. It's one of those Sundays where we've picked out lyrics and songs that practically, with the scripture and everything else, probably is one of those things I should just sit down, because the message is there. This last verse of Susan Werner's song. Susan Werner is such an amazing lyricist. And she wrote this line, "With your fists that shake and your eyes that burn, what makes you do these things you do? I would not be surprised to learn somewhere someone excluded you." We live in a divisive world, right? We live in a polarized world. And in this season of politics, it just comes out even more. We're just seeing it even more extreme than probably many of us have ever seen in a long time. And it reminds me that what science is now telling us, spirituality and mysticism has been saying all along. John Wellwood, who's a psychologist, he's a spiritual psychologist. He wrote a book called The Book of the Psychology of Awakening back in 2003. And one thing he said was the greatest crisis of our time, he wrote this in 2003, the greatest crisis of our time is our sense of disconnection. Now, it seems like such a cliche thing almost, but we're seeing it so magnified today. And we know it in our own lives in smaller ways. That when we are connected, when we feel connected, when we feel we belong, we feel more whole. We feel happier. And people around us feel happier. But when we've experienced this, when we carry around this deep shame or this sense of guilt, that it gets expressed as guilt, but it's deep in our roots, this idea because perhaps we weren't treated well as kids, or perhaps we have experienced exclusion in our lives, or perhaps someone else had done something, but we carry this around. We're not all that much fun to be around. It's hard for us even to be fun to be around with ourselves. We struggle with these things. But here's the interesting thought. Perhaps being reconnected means not simply getting ourselves grounded and rooted, but recognizing that other people are in these same are experiencing these same problems too. Maybe it gives us a little bit of an understanding, not necessarily a reason for accepting or to excuse, but a little more understanding for why people sometimes do the things they do. And that maybe salvation, which really means restoration, maybe salvation is all about simply getting back connected. And how can we do that? So I want to start off here with a quote from one of my favorite philosophers, René Descartes. And you guys know René Descartes, the 17th French philosopher of existentialism. His whole philosophy, it said, is summed up in one great Latin phrase, right? Cogito ergo sum, right? Which means, we'll say it all together in English, 1, 2, 3. I'm looking around and everybody else going like, hey, no, cogito, I don't know. I think, but I took Latin when I was in 11th grade. I went to private school for 1 year, all 5th grade girls in that class, except for one other 5th grade guy. I was such a hot guy in that class. And of course, I had to have Latin because everybody in the private school learned Latin, but that was one of the first phrases we learned. So, I think, therefore, I am. All of his philosophy really centered around this basic existential question. 17th century, we still ask it today. Who am I? Why am I here? Who am I? So I want to tell you a quick joke. I had to set it up. So Descartes walks into a bar. That doesn't seem funny to you? Okay. So Descartes walks into a bar, sits down. The bartender says, "Will you have a beer?" And he says, "I think not," and disappears. So, thank you very much. Yeah, I had 25 people at the first service. They had a better response. Okay. So, I shared this story in the blog, and I want to think with you about this whole idea of who I am, who are we, who we are. And what is this notion of connection, and how does that really speak to this idea of salvation, this light in the darkness, this Jesus telling us that he's the vine and we're the branches, all of these images that are overlapped, that envelop each other and are connected, all these metaphors that we have. What does that mean for us in a world that we still struggle with dualism, with trying to understand things as connected versus as separate? Heaven, hell, you're good, you're bad. I mean, how do we then try to make sense of all of that? And so I told this story in the blog about this experience I had with the National Institute of Drug Abuse and Substance Abuse Information. I was up in D.C. a number of years ago, and I was part of this panel, and it was a conference. It was mostly a conference on storytelling and substance abuse prevention, but it was working with that organization out of the Capitol. And this woman, Sarah Schneider, was the director. Now, listening to Sarah, well, she's a young woman, and she was talking, she was one of the directors of this organization, and she was talking about the power of story and telling her own story, which is what I mentioned in the blog, as she spoke about her own struggles with addiction, and then ended up with this story about Rabbi Susia. But the day before, I had met her and had this connection, not because of anything specific. I mean, I grew up in a dysfunctional family. We had alcoholism in the family and stuff, and substance abuse in the family. But that wasn't the connection. Schneider was the connection, because my middle name is Snyder. And she said, well, that's not Jewish. And I said, Schneider is. And she said, I said, that's right, Schneider is Jewish. She said, but not Snyder. And I said, well, but there's debate. There's debate, you see, because my uncle, my grandmother's great grandfather was a von Schneider, and we always thought he came from the Netherlands and was a Dutch, and then by the time they moved to the Americas, they anglicized it, you know. But I said, but my uncle, whom I loved dearly and who passed away recently, sort of lost it for a while. And he became this radical evangelical fundamentalist who decided that in order to bring about the second coming, he and some of his buddies would go to Israel and would convert Jews to Christianity. Because somewhere in the scripture they had determined in some kind of mathematical formulation that when so many Jews were converted, Jesus is coming back. Now, I don't mind telling you, that's my uncle. But he has great. I've told Uncle Mac stories in here many times before, and you know that, man, it was deeply, deeply dear to me. But he kind of went off the deep end, and there's any number of reasons for that, and I won't even go into that. And I won't even go into debating whether or not you think if enough Jews are converted that Jesus will come again. It's just how he got there that I think is bizarre, because his middle name is Snyder, like mine, but his last name was McDonald, and so he's Scottish. But to live in Jerusalem, if you're going to convert Jews to Christianity, you got to live there. And to live there, you got to stay. You can't just come over with a visa. You have to establish some kind of Jewish connection. So he went to a genealogist and found out through this genealogist that it's a stretch. It's a bit of a stretch. But if you stretch a little bit, you could kind of argue the case that the Schneiders were, in fact, part of the diaspora. And that in Hebrew, Schneider actually means tailor. As in snip, snip, it literally means snip, snip. As in tailor, it was often a tailor's name. And it just so happened that on the English side of our family, we have tailors in England. Their name is Taylor. And through some strange, convoluted process, he established dual citizenship in Israel. My uncle, the McDonald, was a Jew who changed his name from Mac Snyder McDonald to Maxwell von Schneider, or Maxwell Schneider. He took out the von. And actually, that's why you would email him and write him. You would write to Maxwell Schneider. Now, the only reason I say this is because it's very bizarre, and eventually he moved back to America, and he eventually kind of straightened up and kind of leveled out a little bit and got a little saner after a while. But my other uncle, his brother, when he did that, for about 2 years or so while he was over there, he was saying, "We're not Jewish." And we'd go, "It's okay, Uncle Fritz, it's okay to be Jewish." "Well, I'm not Jewish." And so every Hanukkah, we sent him a Hanukkah card. And he would say, "Stop sending me Hanukkah cards." And we'd say Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, and we just loved it. But he was staunchly opposed to that whole idea. I myself love the idea. So I told this story, and Sarah then told me this story. And it was one of the stories that I learned from her, and I'll share it with you before I share the last one. She said, in Israel, the Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of the Hasidic faith in the 17th century. The Baal Shem Tov had gathered his disciples. He was coming towards the end of his life and decided that when you get towards the end of your life, you need to kind of disseminate the information. We give out responsibilities, tasks to different disciples. You want your legacy to continue, your teachings and such, and be very important jobs. And the disciples were excited. They couldn't wait to see what kind of jobs they got. Who was the one he was going to pick to disseminate the teachings? Who would he pick to take care of the monies? All these different jobs. And the rabbi, he went around and he made all these assignments. And then there was this young disciple who was left, kind of the last one, and all the good stuff, so to speak, seemed to be taken. And he turned to him and he said, "What I want you to do is to travel around and tell the stories. Tell the stories about us, about the Hasid, about the rabbi, about my teachings, about your experiences. Tell those stories." And it seems like a good thing, but this young disciple thought, well, you're separating me from the community. He didn't say anything. He dare not say anything to the master, but he felt like, you're going to separate me. And stories, stories, people tell stories all the time. How is telling stories significant? And the rabbi told him, he said, you pass these stories around and you'll know when it's time to stop. And the young disciple was like, well, how will I know? And the rabbi's like, you'll know. You'll just know when it's time. And until then, keep telling them. Well, the rabbi died. The Baal Shem Tov died, and the young disciple did exactly as he was told. Everybody went to their tasks, and this young disciple started traveling around telling stories. And he told stories all around the region, the community, out beyond there, telling mostly, of course, to 2 other Jews in the community. And as he told, people seemed to enjoy them. But everybody knew about the rabbi. Most of them knew because they were part of this local community. So he went beyond sort of that region and found other Jews in other communities and told them stories. This went on for months. Went on for months and months. Occasionally he'd get a little something extra pay. Most of the time he got lodging and food. And he felt pretty relieved because when people enjoy a story, you're listening here. It feels kind of good. People are listening. You're not looking around. You're not getting up and deciding I've had enough. And, it feels good. But after a while it gets old. And it got old for folks. And people had heard it. You told that one last time. After a while, he couldn't find anybody that really was that excited about hearing stories of the rabbi. In fact, it got so bad that people were kind of turning him away. They'd come up with excuses. And after a few months, he hadn't been telling stories to anybody. He'd hang out with the other Jews doing their things, feeling like he'd pretty much had no purpose. And it was getting desperate for him. A couple of months further passed, and he heard about someone. He actually got word that there was this nobleman, this wealthy guy in Spain, which was not too far, a couple of days' travel from where they were. And if this nobleman loved stories of the Baal Shem Tov. Well, he was so excited. All right, a new audience. Somebody would actually like the stories. So he grabbed up his stuff, packed himself up, and he headed out. A couple of days later, he ends up in this small city, this little town of sorts in Spain. And he comes right to this wonderful mansion of a palace almost, and a servant comes running out down the pathway to greet him because the servant said, you do not know how much my master has been waiting for this day. And he takes him inside. The disciple says, well, where is he? I'll tell him what I know. No, said, you need to rest. You've been out all these couple of days traveling. You need to rest. Tomorrow morning, we gather for a feast in the morning. Tell your stories. So he hadn't even met the nobleman, and he got all cleaned up and rested that night. The next morning, he came into this big, huge room, and there was a nobleman sitting there at the table. The servant was helping with the food. He welcomed him, was so excited. He sat him down, hardly let him take a bite, and said, tell me, I have been so anxious to hear stories of the Baal Shem Tov. For the last few years, I have longed to see these stories. And the young disciple smiled. He was so excited. But not a single story came to mind. He opened his mouth. It was like he was choking on the silence. Nothing was coming. He was trying to remember. He was not even having like a senior moment because nothing was, maybe it was the pressure. Maybe it's the anxiety. Maybe it's the sense of pressure and that you've got to do. He said, you rest for another afternoon. Tomorrow we'll try it again. Well, it went on like this for a couple of days. The young guy could not think of one story to tell. He says, I knew the man. I can describe him to you. He couldn't think of one experience. And after a couple of days, the nobleman got kind of put off. He was sad. He was really disappointed, but he also was getting kind of impatient. And he said, I'm disappointed. I'm sorry. And the young man said, well, I'm not going to waste your time. And he got up to leave. And as he hit the door, opened it up, that's when a story came to him. Just one incident came to him. And he said, this will prove that I knew the master. So the guy sat down, the nobleman sat down, said, okay, don't eat, don't distract yourself, tell me what you know. He said, all right, I remember a time some years back when I was very young, just a new disciple. He said, I remember the Baal Shem Tov took us to the middle of a city. It was near Krakow, and we were headed to the city, and it was during the Easter festivities, just before Easter. This was not a good time to be out in the streets because the Christians in the community in that day, they persecuted us. They would shout, Jesus killer, Messiah killer. And they would persecute us. And sometimes they would even beat us to close to death. So we hid whenever that season come around. And here the Baal Shem Tov says we are going to Krakow. And then as we get to Krakow, he doesn't hide us in the houses. We hide, but he says we are going out into the streets. And while we're waiting there to see if he's that crazy, that's when the bishop and the whole procession come marching into the square. And as they are, they're singing their songs and they're beating drums and shouting, and our hearts are all beating because we're terrified and we don't want to be discovered. And the Baal Shem Tov turns to me, the disciple said, he turns to me and he says, go out and tell the bishop I want to talk to him. And he says, Rabbi, they'll kill me. But the rabbi said, trust me. And I always trusted what the rabbi said. And so I walked out into the street and the procession stopped and you could see the anger. And I don't even know why, but you could see the anger facing me. And then I thought the bishop would send them on me at once, but instead the bishop motioned for me to come to him. And when I told him the rabbi wants to speak to him, he quickly jumped off the carriage, held the procession, and told them to wait, and came into the house. And he and the rabbi went into the back room, and they talked for several hours. And we thought it was over. We expected them to come through the door at any moment, and when the door, suddenly there was a bang on it, that's when the bishop came out of the back room. He and the rabbi embraced. And then he went back out into the street, got into the carriage, and the procession rode off. And the rabbi looked at me, and he said, we can go now. When the disciple had finished telling the story, he had been staring at the floor to make sure he didn't forget the details. He looked up, and he saw that the nobleman was no longer paying attention. He had bent over the table and was visibly sobbing. And the disciple said, well, I must have told you that, I'm sorry, the wrong story. This is not what you wanted to hear. I wished I had a more exciting, interesting story. It's the only thing I remember. And the nobleman raised his head and he looked at him with tears in his eyes and he said, no, you told the story you needed to tell. I was that bishop. That was me. And the disciple didn't understand, and he said, well, perhaps I should explain that I grew up Jewish. I was a Jew all my life, but things got bad. When Christianity took over, Jews were hardly thought of as anything but something to punch, to persecute. And the pressure of my family and the pressure of some of the others around me, they began to hide behind masks. And I myself no longer could accept who I was. But I became a Christian and began to persecute my own people. And the rabbi knew that. He knew I wasn't who I was. And he approached me, and when I talked to him, I begged for his mercy. And he said to me, I don't need to beg for your mercy. You don't need to beg for my mercy. He said, you will know that you are forgiven when you have heard your own story. And you'll be made whole. And the nobleman looked at the disciple and said, I know today I've been made whole because you've told me my own story. The next day then, Sarah Schneider, after telling that story to me, stood up in front and she began talking about her struggles with addiction and her struggles with knowing who she was. And not just her religious heritage as a Jew, but her being as a person. She had forgotten all of that. And she explained for a number of reasons why that had taken place, but that she had run in every direction and to every kind of mask, including substances and including a lifestyle that was self-destructive. And then she smiled and she said, it was the people around me. It was the people that just held on to me in different ways. They didn't enable me, they just were there. They just reminded me something of love. They just reminded me something of connection. They just reminded me that there was another me that maybe I hadn't been in touch with. And that's when she stopped in front of the group when she said, there was another me that I hadn't been in touch with. And Sarah got visibly choked up. And then she said, I suddenly remembered a story my mother told me. And it's the story that I put in the blog, and the story that has this quote from Martin Buber, who was a Hasidic Jew and collected these stories. And she told us the story of Rabbi Susia, who, when he approached his disciples, was terrified. Look in his face. He said, I have something to confess. And they said, what have you seen? And he said, I saw a terrible vision. And his disciples said to him, how could you see a terrible vision? You're the kindest, best, goodest, you're the most kind-hearted person we know, the most genuine person we know. How could you, whom we follow, see a terrifying vision? And he said, because in my dream, the angels were there. And as I approached the next world, the angels asked me a question. He said, they didn't ask me, why wasn't I more like Moses? Or why wasn't I more like Elijah? They looked me straight through me and said, why weren't you more like Susia? One of the most challenging things, I think, is this idea that we are disconnected. And how do we reconnect? I want to share with you this last little poem as we finish up. Only because I think it speaks to everything. And we know this, many of us know this poem. But when we think about the ways in which Jesus taught about connection, I think sometimes we forget that power of connection is already within us. That light is already within us. Once we can get past the mask that we wear because of our fear, our shame, our anxieties, once we can simply let go enough to get close to the ground of our being, we start recognizing that connection in one another. We start hearing our stories in one another. Mary Oliver's poem, Wild Geese, if there was ever a poem that said to me the nature of salvation, I'll share it with you. This is it. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert, repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. So tell me about your despair. Yours, I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. The sun, the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the geese are flying high up in the clear blue sky, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, no matter how isolated, no matter what shame you might feel, no matter what sense of disconnection, whoever you are, the world offers itself to your imagination. It calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, as if calling your name, as if reminding you, be more like you. Be more like the divine that is within you. Remember your connection. And reminding you that over and over, we have a place in the family of things. What are the angels saying to you? Why aren't you more like you? Amen.